Hi, everyone. My name is Bhaskar Sankara. I'm the editor and publisher of Jacobin, and I'm a longtime member of the Democratic Socialists of America. And today, on the occasion of the DSA biennial convention, we are doing a panel on the past, present, and future of DSA, how we surged, what was kind of our base that we started from, and how we can continue to grow in the future. And we have some very excellent panelists to join us for this conversation. And as a brief introduction about my own involvement in DSA, I joined sometime in 2007. I think I just turned 18. I went to my first few DSA. Actually, it was a YDS back then, Metro YDS. We had these things. Meetings in New York City where I met Maria and David and a host of other people. And I found within DSA an incredible community of people committed to building a better world, people who acted as great comrades, gave me a lot of guidance, were incredibly committed in very bleak political times to making a difference and working in coalition with broad forces in a country that during those years really didn't seem like it had any sort of future for socialism. And obviously now we're in a much different position. DSA is close to 20 times larger than it was back then, and it's in no part, I think, due to the work of many of the people on the panel, and obviously a lot of you who are participating like all week and devoting so much of your time and energy to this project. And I should say that sometimes I think when we're in relatively small groups, we risk the trap of saying we were in a group with 5,000 members. Now we're in a group with close to 100,000 members. That means that in 5 years' time, we might be in a group with 500,000 members, then 2.5 billion members or whatever else. And I think that was a trap that sometimes we could fall into, which is this excessive confidence to think that things are just going to grow at the same rate. But on the other hand, I think we could fall into the other sort of pessimism of not taking seriously how much we've accomplished and how much the fact that DSA and socialism more broadly really exists on the U.S. Political map. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And what I'll do is just actually start switched up a little bit and have the panelists just start with a very quick lightning round of just mentioning briefly when they first joined DSA and maybe something about them. So we have on the panel David Dewald, we have Maria Schwartz, we have Beth Wang, we have Bill Fletcher Jr., and we have
yourself.
Yeah. In any case, I think that's a great place for us to start with. How about we start with Beth? Do you wanna jump kick it off?
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Beth Wong. I go by she, her, and hers. I'm part of the Boston Democratic Socialists of America, where I'm one of the 2 membership coordinators. I first joined DSA in the week after the 2016 election, when all of us were going through some form of political hangover. And I come from the student movement and was the coordinator of the Student Labor Action Project from 2014 to 2016.
Maria, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Maria Schwartz, she, her. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York, and I'm DSA's national director. I first joined as a college student involved in the, as we called it then, YDS. And that was in the late 90s, believe it or not, right around the turn of the century. And then I went on to stay involved, also went into the labor movement for about 10 years. And then I became DSA's national director after that.
the late 90s, back when The Activist was a print publication,
Yes.
right? I think I
Indeed.
got my hands once on one of those old copies. Bill, why don't you jump in next?
Thank you, Bhaskar. Bill Fletcher, he, him, live in Maryland. Been on and off a member of DSA for I'm not sure how many years. A friend of mine basically leaned on me, actually a former national director, and said, you know, you need to just do it. And so that's what happened. I come out of the Marxist movements of the 1970s and 80s and have a very different kind of political history than most of the founders of DSA. We can talk about that some later.
Yeah, that's a good that's a good cliffhanger or something. I feel like the pilot episode just ended. But David, how last but not least, please.
Yeah. So hi, I'm David Dewald. I joined the Young Democratic Socialists, as it was called then, in 2003 when I was a college student in Bowdoin, in Maine. I was then pretty active in what was then called the Coordinating Committee, which is the leadership of YDS. And then I became staff for the Youth Organizer, which is how I met Bhaskar. And I've held several other roles, both volunteer and staff since then. And right now, I am the vice chair of the Democratic Socialist America Fund, which is a C3 sister organization. And my pronouns are he, him, and I live in central Brooklyn. My most recent chapter before that was Metro DC, which is how I knew Beth and Bill too.
All right, so I will avoid the urge to structure my questions in the panel entirely chronological, because I think that'll be a little bit a little boring. So I guess to start with, you all laid out a little bit about how you first encountered DSA, but I guess that since chronologically you're the newest to DSA, even though you're a longstanding member, I'm wondering whether you could describe your first impressions with DSA when you first encountered it. I guess probably when you were doing work with United Students Against Sweatshop and Jobs with Justice, SLAP project and things like that. Like what how did it compare to national student government work and campus labor activism you did in college in your first position with Jobs with Justice?
Great. Happy to kick us off with some with much more recent history. I came out of the Wisconsin Uprising in 2011, fighting against everything evil that Scott Walker and the Republican Party was doing in Wisconsin, from destroying labor unions to putting in place voter ID laws, gutting the public sector, and generally shortening people's lives. And it was really clear to me in 2011 that the right wing had an agenda to take over and hold power for as long as possible. And it was really not clear to me what the opposite of that was and who the countervailing forces were. And that's when I doubled down and became a 24 hours a day organizer with United Students Against Sweatshops on my campus at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And after college, I went into the labor movement, and then when I was moving to DC to become the Student Labor Action Project Coordinator, a project of Jobs with Justice and the U.S. Student Association, I met David Dewald on my first day moving to DC. We were both crashing at Chris Hicks' apartment in DC. And to be honest, I thought YDS was a little bit niche back then. But I did have immense respect for the membership model and the the interest in deepening political education beyond just the kind of run-of-the-mill campus activist and campaigning, which so frequently is showing up at the steps of your school's administration building and not doing a whole lot beyond that. But I think the moment when I realized that YDS was something very real was during the Bernie Sanders campaign. And eventually, the Student Labor Action Project, unfortunately, became a little bit out of sync with the missions of both the U.S. Student Association, which was, quite frankly, on life support at the time, and Jobs with Justice. And I was the last SLAP coordinator. And so when I was trying to figure out what to do with the 15 chapters, it really seemed like YDS in 2016 was absolutely on the upsurge with the merger with Students for Bernie. And that's when I really got to know David well. Unfortunately, that did not work. But honestly, in hindsight, in 2021, almost all of the student networks that I have come out of have been in deep decline, whether it's because of grant funding that's been drying up, whether it's because of the toll that Janus has taken on union contributions to student organizations and a litany of other reasons. But YDSA and Student Action, the student project of Student Action, are the only two national student organizations on the left that have grown in the past 5 years. Meanwhile, Turning Point USA and the right wing has invested a huge amount of infrastructure in campus student organizing, and that's something that we all should be aware of.
You mentioned our membership model, and I think that's something that is very easy to take for granted. The fact that we're part of a coalition with lots of different groups that are structured in different ways, but there is something really special about how democratic DSA is, how much membership involvement there is. And obviously that takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of resources. And yeah, it's always something that's really attracted me to DSA. It comes with headaches, but I think the headaches are definitely outweighed by and I think that's the reason why a lot of people gravitated towards DSA, because even though it was an established organization, it was an organization that you felt like you could shape and move in a certain direction if you built enough support. You were speaking to the needs of both the organization and it's the wider politics it was engaged with. Maria, I guess my question for you is, I can completely understand why someone would join the staff of DSA today. It's a growing organization. There's lots of exciting organizing projects to engage with, and so on. But joining the DSA staff around 10 years ago was very different. It was a small organization, probably was less financially secure too, so you weren't sure like maybe how stable it would be in the long run. We had a very long-standing national director, Frank Llewellyn, who kind of kept us going through some lean years, but I think there was only two full-time staff positions at the time, including the national director. So can you tell me what in the world compelled you to make to join the two-person staff of a democratic socialist organization in the middle of the first Obama term?
You set the stage so well. Yeah, the reason that I joined the staff of DSA certainly didn't have to do with stability. It was just about the politics. And when I first realized I was a socialist, it was when I was a college student, and I had sort of an epiphany moment. I'd grown up in a union family, and my dad was in a union. 3 of my grandparents were union members, and I had this general understanding of collective action.
Yo tenía
I wasn't a red diaper baby. When I was exposed to socialist ideas, it just clicked for me, and that's when I became a lifelong socialist. And my politics has developed over time, but it really was this idea that nobody else was talking about class. Nobody else had a structural analysis. And despite, how DSA was in a moment of decline and sort of on life support because of the politics that had been in existence for 20 years, 30 years, it it really spoke to me because I knew, I tell people that I sort of predicted someone like Trump would come along eventually. I realized that when I was a college student, when I became a socialist, I realized that if we didn't basically take back our society, then people would be scapegoated. The power of division was too strong, and obviously, and the solutions were not out there. And so when I think about what happened after Trump was elected, I mean, we can talk more about what it was like when we built up our ability and our power when we were supporting Bernie early on. It was really when Trump was elected that people flooded into DSA, as Beth can attest. And a huge part of that was fear of Trump, but also the desire to go somewhere different. All these foundation funded nonprofits had people just, they didn't have real solutions. They weren't talking about structural solutions. They didn't point out the problems as they existed. And DSA was, we were pretty snarky and small, but we were really talking about the things, the solutions that we needed to enact. And I think that it just felt very important to me. So I was relatively young. I'd been in the labor movement for about 10 years. And I wasn't looking for stability. I really felt this deep need to change the world. And what I saw was the same thing that a lot more people saw later, which is that these politics, which have deep roots in this country and have evolved over time, are fundamentally important. And in the United States, they hadn't existed in a vehicle that had mass appeal for a long time. And it was very important to me to keep that flame alive. And David and I can talk about some of the things that we did over the years that sort of set the stage to enable us to grow when the moment came.
So, David, I don't want to jump ahead, but just for the sake of clarification for anyone watching who's maybe new to DSA or still figuring out kind of this structure, you like Maria were on DSA staff, but you also served on the MPC. I know most people probably know the difference, but I'm wondering whether you can, in a nutshell, explain the role of the MPC and the role of staff, and then more broadly, how you see that dynamic evolving from when DSA was very small to now, the challenges of kind of the separation of powers, both in a broader, maybe not necessarily in a broader ideological sense, but at the very least in like a practical sense between the two. I'm not sure if that was perhaps the best, most articulate way of framing that question, but I'll kind of leave it to you.
I'm happy to take it from there. And I know that a lot of the convention delegates here will be considering the questions around staffing and the elected leadership, both in their ballots and also in some of the resolutions and constitutional proposals that are coming up. So I'm not going to speak about those specifically, but I'll talk about my time and to kind of give insights into how the roles have changed. So I have been on both, as I alluded to earlier, I've been on both the national leadership of what was then called the Young Democratic Socialists. So that was a smaller leadership, was a 12 young people, mostly students, who were elected at an annual August conference. And then I also after I served as the youth organizer, I then got elected to the National Political Committee, which is elected at every convention, is legally the board of DSA. And I think what's important to remember is two things. So one is it used to be called the National Executive Committee, but they changed the name because they really wanted to express political direction, that it was a body that kind of led the organization politically in between conventions. But as we're talking about, when the organization was 2.5 full-time employees and 1 part-time bookkeeper, if you were an MPC member, you actually did a lot more admin work. So I was chair of personnel committee, which meant I was the de facto HR for DSA. I led a lot of search processes, including the one that hired Maria, but also hired numerous youth organizers. And so but that was just a role. So while you kind of went in assuming you'd be writing political statements, you're actually doing a lot just to keep the basic functions of the organization going because there wasn't enough staff capacity. And I think as the organization changed, so did the need for the role of the NPC as well. And I remember this distinct moment when Maria and I were dealing with like a crisis where there had been a scandal about a candidate, and I was like, well, and I kind of took a moment to think like, wow, these are real organizational problems that we used to not have. Like our problems used to be like, what's the caterer? No one likes the vegan caterer. Then it was actually dealing with like national politics and being seen. And so our roles, so the staff roles really changed. So the NPC, and the NPC had to take on much more political leadership, much more adjudicating and being involved in the lives of chapters to deal with disputes. Largely when we were on the NPC, that I think of one instance when this came up, in my time at both staff and on the NPC, if something rose from the chapter level on up to us to have to like intervene, and it just wasn't as dynamic. So I think that's a kind of critical thing for people to think about is like, if you're on a national leader, what is the role that you play, both elected and staff, because they're both leaders in their own ways. And it was easier when I was in YDSA because students need more support. You're kind of more like a coach. It was much clearer what I did. When you're deputy director, you're really trying to, connect people and also bring them into the organization as community members and helping rise the ranks and build chapters and political projects in different ways. And so it's a balance of like, how much do the staff and the NPC have to work together and listen to each other. And we've definitely, so I always want to remind people like, these tensions that sometimes we see in DSA and the beauty of a democratic organization, like are things we've always had. Like I've been on NPCs where we were very upset because we didn't get a choice, because we hadn't had a chance to discuss debating a candidate. And then I took that information when I was and then I helped create with the NPC as a staff member, like what people know now is kind of this bottom-up endorsement process where the endorsements come from the chapters, they have to go to the NPC. Now we have a national electoral committee, but that came out of like democratic struggle of working staff and NPC having to work things out. And I think if you have some good faith, you can create solutions together. And I think that's the kind of key thing is like the elected leaders and the staff really need to be partners because the staff are there to kind of see the work that the convention and the leadership want out, and with the understanding that that I've been NPC do, it's like I'm a volunteer, I don't have to do this, and respecting people's time and the fact that they're giving up significant parts of their life to do this, is something we should really always respect.
So speaking of problems that now exist with DSA, of actually having the resources to figure out how to allocate those resources and how much to staff and what to staff and what relationship staff should have with volunteers and so on. I remember when I used to hang around with you around the DSA office in like 2007, 2008, one of our big battles with the otherwise benevolent rule of Frank Llewellyn was over whether we could get like a water cooler or something in the office.
Said no money.
Said no, tap water is fine. So we would just take our mugs and go to the bathroom down the hall. And DSA rented space in, actually still rent space in Wall Street. So it's filled with people who are like doing business and commerce and whatever else. We're in the same building. We're in this little socialist, office with a window facing a brick wall at the time. I think the view has maybe improved slightly since then. And walking out to the warm water while people stared at us confusingly. But yes, that was the right kind of austerity for the time, for sure. So, Bill, I'm wondering whether you left us with a great cliffhanger, and I've had many conversations with you over the years about your background with roots in the new communist movement, and actually I remember you but you have been around DSA for a while, at least as a friendly interlocutor, even when you might not necessarily have been a member. Like I remember you spoke at that 2008 maybe 2007, 2008 winter conference, the first winter conference I went to. I think you gave a talk that was really well received. So I'm wondering if you could give us your brief impressions of DSA at the time, but also tell us about other socialist organizations, the dynamics of the 2010s, when there was, I guess, maybe a different sort of constellation of left groups before it seems like DSA was obviously the one to grow and to exert kind of more gravitational pull. If that makes sense.
So, so first of all, thank you again for inviting me to do this. I think it's important for folks to understand that there's different kinds of organizations on the left structurally. Cadre organizations, semi-cadre organizations, and more mass socialist or mass left organizations. And so I come out of a time in the 70s and early 80s when people on the revolutionary left, whether they were Maoists, Trotskyists, Stalinists, or autonomous or whatever, were in the process of building cadre and semi-cadre organizations. Very different experience than DSA. At that time, it wasn't DSA, it was DSOC, the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, which then later became DSA when it merged with the New American Movement. And they were different kinds of organizations that both had a different sense of their mission as well as what it meant to be a member. So in the groups of the New Communist Movement and groups like the Puerto Rican Socialist Party and the Trotskyist groups, there was an expectation of what members would do, including deploying people. And I don't mean this in an authoritarian way, but I mean people moving to other cities to set up districts, to set up new areas of work. DSA has grown largely as a result of a number of things, and one of those has been that it strategically emphasized the continuation of student work, and so YDS, I think, was really central. For many years, what would happen is that people would become active in YDS, they would graduate from college, and they might become a member of DSA, but only in name, and did very little and just sort of drifted off into the ether. But the YDS chapters gave a certain kind of vitality. And I think that DSA was very well positioned in the in the later 2000s for the eruptions that were taking place, and because it's easy to join DSA. And so a combination, I would start with the Arab Spring, which I think I almost always start with as the triggering mechanism for virtually everything, including the Wisconsin Uprising and Occupy. And there was a new and growing interest in alternatives to capitalism. And then, of course, the Sanders campaign. And as a result of the Sanders campaign and the discussion of democratic socialism as a term, DSA was well positioned for that. But it immediately faced a challenge, which was there were a lot of people coming in and there was no effective orientation program for new members. And this was something that I know some of the earlier leaders were very concerned about. And so it was sort of like being hit by a tsunami. And this, I believe, has created certain challenges for DSA, which DSA has not yet resolved. But so on the one hand, the organization has grown substantially. But what it means to be a member is to a great extent up for grabs.
So, yeah, I don't want to stick too long in the past because like they said on The Sopranos, remember when is the lowest form of conversation. But I'm wondering, since Bill brought up YDS, it kind of does remind me that back then the line about DSA and the broader left, at least, was that YDS was dynamic, DSA itself was stagnant. And I do remember a lot of tension of like YDSers not really liking or being able to integrate very well into existing DSA chapters. That's kind of one reason why we had these metro YDS chapters, which were just an excuse to try to keep people in the DSA orbit without making them join a real DSA chapter. That's maybe a crude way to put what a metro YDS became, at least. But I'm wondering whether, David, whether you or Maria can talk about how that tension was resolved. Was it just simply the fact that DSA ballooned in size and now the DSA chapters are filled with people who are only slightly older in median age than the YDS chapter because we're YDSA chapters because we're a very young organization now? Was it something else? And David, and also if you want to reflect more broadly on the period of building YDS, because I think you deserve a lot of credit for that. You took it very seriously. I remember the only time I've heard David say a stern word for me was when I was doing very sloppy data entry of like handwritten email lists, like circulated from my sign up.
Remember that?
And he said, you missed an entry. What if that was our future Lenin? So yes, maybe I deprived us for future Lenin, but if either you or Maria or Beth or anyone wants to jump in, please do.
Maria, do you want to go first? Because I have some specific things, but I want to give you a chance.
Sure. So this question of how to build an intergenerational movement is really key, and what I think that still challenges us today, although it's the inverse. At that time, the dynamic you described was absolutely true. And David was a few years younger than me.
I still am a few years younger than you, but yeah.
Indeed. And we worked together. I was in YDSA. I was a YDSA national co-chair for a couple of years. And then I was involved at DSA, and then he was the youth organizer. So we worked together, and we recognized that it was necessary to bring YDSA into DSA. And there were a number of ways that we did that, but I think one of the most important was we essentially did organic leader identification in both DSA and YDSA. And we set up summer retreats where we would bring in both young people and the more experienced older folks to just build relationships, and we would read texts together and socialize together and talk about organizing together and do trainings. Because, capitalism divides us. We live very atomized lives. We live with a lot of separation between generations for some people. And it's necessary to build those kinds of relationships. So we set up a program to try to be really intentional about that. And that was, part of a broader set of things that we did to both bring YDSA and DSA together, and also help DSA address some of its own structural issues, so that would be a place that could take in new people. And that really, I think, helps set the foundation for the next few years. I remember when Obama, a lot of our publicity, frankly, early on came because the Republicans called Obama a socialist. And I remember us doing an intergenerational contingent at a big rally in Washington. And we had a gigantic banner that said, Obama's not a socialist, but we are. And it was like another part of that intergenerational building that we did, which took years. But I really do credit that with making it possible for us to grow slowly, slowly start growing, and then create a foundation that was able to sustain the tsunami, which definitely came after Trump was elected.
Cool. And can I chime in? So what I want to reflect on, jumping off of what Maria said, was that, and to put it in context for today and to think about the future, is that DSA has benefited tremendously through its hard work, but also these giant growths in membership from events that are out of our control. Trump getting elected, AOC getting elected. I mean, we had a role in that, but these are like things that attract lots of people. And really until the membership drive, which was a success in bringing in a lot of people, we hadn't done some of these strategic kind of planning. And so when you're a small organization, you can't rely on these outside external events. So you have to plan more ahead if you want to survive, much less just exist. And so the example I'm going to give, so Maria talked about building these organic these trains, and I'll add, like, we did them every other year. It was in between conventions, and we stopped doing that, but a lot of people who did that are YDSA leaders now. And similar to what Bill mentioned earlier, there's lots of people who were in YDS, that's what it was called then, who then, when Trump got elected, rejoined, our chapter leaders now, our delegates, but hadn't been, so like just that level of sowing the seeds really blossomed. And also, sometimes you just also have to take a pause and think organizing. So like when I was the YDS organizer, I inherited 4 chapters. Can you imagine an organization of 4 chapters now has 120? And what I said was I couldn't just organize everywhere. I was one human being, it was, and so what I said was I ended up just focusing on like students colleges without a strong left presence. So the YDSA chapter could be the only game in town. And I found chapters who were clubs, specifically clubs who were like independent socialist groups, like I had been at Bowdoin, and got them to affiliate. And that grew the organization to 12 chapters. I mean, it sounds like nothing now, but I mean, it was actually a big deal. And what I'm trying to instill is like the role here sometimes in these moments when our membership is plateauing is not to look inward and be like, what are we doing wrong? Sometimes it's just the political environment. There was no way, and I've given this talk to YDSAers, there's no way for us to be 100 chapters 12 years ago. Just the political climate wasn't there for that. But there was ways to grow and be strategic about it. And I think as we go into the future, we have to start coming together as an organization and being like, how do we reach out to others and not just look inward and what we're doing wrong, and think about also like, how do we build? And I'm just going to pause. I know Beth wanted to get in as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting hearing about what YDS was as someone who wasn't involved in YDS, but was adjacent to it. So many YDS members are now DSA leaders. That makes a lot of sense. And similarly, I was the one national organizer for a national student network and was able to grow SLAP also from 4 real chapters to 15 chapters. And I can't even imagine managing or coordinating 120 chapters. Like, that is actually really incredible. And I think what is really interesting now is that not only is every serious YDSer back in the day, but every serious USASer, every serious SLAPtivist, every serious USSA alumnus are all in DSA now. I remember the 2019 convention just felt like a big reunion of the student movement from 2010 to 2013. And that's actually a huge reason why I joined in 2016, is I just saw lots of everyone who I thought of as a serious organizer from the student movement from the early 2010s seemed to have been in DSA in 2016. And so, for all of the faults of how we onboarded people and more, like, we actually did recruit some of the most serious and committed student activists and student movement alumni from at least the early 2010s in that 2016 membership boom. And I think that's done a lot to shape what DSA is now in 2021.
So I want to shift to some both more forward-looking, but also slightly more contentious in a good way, like interesting questions. Don't worry, I'm still a softball interviewer. This is Jill Stein once said I was a softball interviewer in the best way possible after finishing interviewing. I asked lots of like Oprah questions of like, so like, how is this feeling? You're doing all these things or whatever. Anyway, so Bill, I'm wondering whether you could talk a little bit about. Okay, so now DSA is in a different situation than it was in the past. It is a much larger socialist organization in membership than any other existing socialist organization on the U.S. left. And yes, you made a very crucial distinction between cadre-based organizations and what it demands of members, like the criteria for membership, and a more broad membership organizations. But even factoring that in, probably if you break down, the numbers, there's many more times DSA cadre or DSA very, active members than other socialist organizations. So I'm wondering, how does that change the way we should think? And I know this is kind of like, I know you're a DSA member, but this is kind of giving us advice as someone who has also been outside of the actual DSA milieu. How should we interact and collaborate with other groups? Does this change the way we think about collaborating with groups on the socialist left? Or maybe, let's start with the socialist left in particular, because I do feel like there was a moment where it'd be pretty easy for us to say DSA, CCDS, maybe the CP, Friso, whoever would sit down and maybe we could organize a convention together, or maybe we could do something, kind of as co-equals. Now the DSA has so much more membership and gravitational pull. Does it make as much sense to think about it that way, of being equal members in a coalition? So yeah, I figured that'd be a good question to pose you.
No, it's a great question. So I think, Bhaskar, that part of the problem is that DSA historically has never been able to figure out its relationship to the rest of the left. When it was in the low thousands, one of the things that I found myself often doing when I would speak with DSA folks was try to encourage them to engage with other folks on the left. And I frequently got a response like, well, do you think anyone else would be interested in what we have to say? Or there would be a sort of very polite sectarianism towards the rest of the left. As DSA has grown, I think that there's a tendency within DSA that I saw in the CP historically, which was to identify itself with the left. In other words, the left is the CP is the left. And in this case, the left is DSA is the left. And I happened into an NPC meeting before Bernie Sanders announced his candidacy. And there was a discussion going on about DSA's relationship to the projected Sanders candidacy. And what struck me was that there was no discussion about two things that I thought of real importance. One was down ballot elections, and the second was the rest of the left, and whether or not DSA should engage with the rest of the left on an electoral strategy. And my conclusion has been that there is an absorption orientation within DSA. That is, to some extent, the organization is not decided whether it's a federation or an organization. And the second is, if it's going to grow, does it grow by absorbing, sort of like the Borg in Star Trek? Or does it grow by uniting? And growing by uniting is a very different orientation because it really is identifying other organizations, regardless of size, that are out there, and a sort of reconfiguration. And so I don't feel that coming from DSA. So the other part of this, Bhaskar, is this. A few years ago, before this massive growth, there was a poll that was taken, and Bill O'Reilly was announcing it on Fox, and he was gloating because the poll had indicated that 7 out of 10 people in the U.S. favored capitalism. Now, me being the mischievous person, said, that's fascinating. So that means 3 out of 10 aren't. So I pulled out my calculator and figured out that was about, you eliminate people under the age of 18. We're talking about 72 million people. And I would argue that none of us on the left think at that scale. We think in dozens, maybe for you guys, maybe hundreds, but none of us thinks about what does it mean to build a movement and organizations, plural, that can speak to and be rooted among 72 million people. And one of the things is that means you're going to be an organization with people you don't necessarily like. You're going to have a mechanism for resolving differences that don't come down to shooting people at Central Committee meetings and purging folks. That you have to figure out a way of identifying what are the necessary points of unity that are essential for an organization that's going to operate at that scale. And also that there may not just be one organization, there may be multiple organizations. And we've got to figure out how to work as comrades, as opposed to corporate competitors.
So, Bill, I think those are great comments. And I'll pose the question, but with a different angle to whoever wants to jump in for the rest of the panel, which is generally I agree with Bill's sentiments, but to play kind of devil's advocate, often I feel like organizations like DSA, which are particularly democratic, which are particularly open, can be at a disadvantage when encountering very disciplined cadre structured groups. We saw it in the past with SDS in a very different environment, and we saw before. So in other words, how do we maintain our inclusivity, but also perhaps in the future interact with groups that are democratic centralist in more traditional ways, or who are otherwise structured just with a stronger ideological line? Maybe you agree with it, maybe you disagree with the particular line, but are more structured and more cohesive, even though they're smaller in the numbers in DSA, but they want to work within DSA, as opposed to what Bill suggests, which is the ecosystem of the left, which is we have to acknowledge there are going to be people who are going to be parts of different groups. Some of them will be groups to our right that are just doing something a little bit different and focused on ballot campaigning. For example, like a Justice Democrats like formations, and sometimes they're going to be smaller activist socialist organizations that are maybe harder on the Democratic Party question, or otherwise doing great organizing, and we should have to work with on particular issues like an anti-war campaign or something. But what happens when we kind of run into the I guess the old SDS question, or the old question of looser, more democratic structures and more disciplined groups?
Can anyone take that, or is it for Bill?
Oh, that's for anyone. That's right. That's for the rest of you. If anyone wants.
Well, I'll take it briefly because I want to push back a little bit on what Bill said, since it's good to not just agree. I mean, I agree with Bill about a couple things. I agree, like, DSA should not just be the left, whether that's our own sense of self-worth. And I agree that DSA needs to reach out. And I think if we're thinking about the future, what worked in the past, and that's what we're trying to build those bridges here from the past to the future, is when DSA is doing what Bill said, is like reaching out and recognizing it's one of many organizations. And for me, it's partly on the socialist left, but it's also it's why Beth's here, because Beth here as in like she's part of DSA, because DSA was in coalition, sometimes in small ways, as the smaller partner with like the Student Labor Action Project in the Student Economic Justice Coalition, whether it was with both the anti-capitalist left and the liberal left in anti-war. And then most recently, was organizing with the Bernie-crat organizations to do the People Summits for 2 years. And I think being present in those struggles whereas Bill is saying, you are trying to be one of many, not the dominant partner, and you're also introducing yourself to their bases, and these are not mutually exclusive bases. You can be members of more than one organization, be active in different groups. And so I really think for DSA, the future is both relating to these groups in terms of being coalition partners and building them, and I think, and really avoiding we're the only game in town, which I sometimes see in electoral work, which becomes these, I frankly feel, very false narratives that DSA won X election when I know there was like other groups working hard, and I think that's like just bad coalition politics and also getting high on your own supply, which is both bad for you. But also with the left, I mean, we have to recognize that DSA comes from a tradition that believes in multi-tendency politics, and that means we also have to respect that coalition building also is in us, and we do have to resolve. And I don't have a perfect answer of like how that works out exactly. I think Bill sums it up well. Are we an organization or a federation? And right now we lean more towards a coalition of socialists, and we have to figure out that internally. But I do think it comes down to that, you know, we are an organization that people have to have a big tent. And people can't just kind of come in with their own external agendas. And I always distinguish between caucuses. Caucuses are not perfect, but at least are people who they're in the organization to change the organization, are not coming from another group to form a group within it. Because all the caucuses that I know are independent of an external organization. I think that's the kind of key thing to keep in mind with tendency. Is like you can be a tendency, but the tendency can only exist in the socialist group.
Bhaskar, if I can just jump in real quick on that.
Please, anyone, please
so,
jump in.
I appreciate what you were just saying, David. So I'm in a group called Liberation Road. It's a small group that used to be known as Freedom Road. And so we have not gone into DSA as an organization. We have some members that are in DSA like yours truly. But we made a decision, that's not what we're doing. Whereas there's other organizations that have made very different decisions. And it seems to me that one of the critical things as DSA grows is to establish, do you want organizations coming in or do you want individuals? And what does it mean to be a DSA member? Is there a bottom line so that whether you're in Nevada or whether you're in Maine, that people know what it means to be in DSA, even if there are different political tendencies? Because I think that you're right when the objective should be to have a multi-tendency organization, but there needs to be a sufficient bottom line so everyone knows that it doesn't matter whether you're in the Seattle chapter or St. Louis chapter, you know basically what it means to be in DSA. And that becomes critical. The other thing that becomes critical, and I would really just double underline this, is that for DSA desperately needs clarity on racism and national oppression if it's going to grow. If it's going to grow past where it is now, it's got to establish much more clarity. And there's a line struggle that's going on within DSA that sometimes is subtle and sometimes is less subtle about the strategic significance or insignificance of issues of racism and national oppression. And I would argue when you look at the United States as coming out of a settler colonial state with racial slavery, that building unity around this lays the foundation, I believe, for the organization taking major steps forward, regardless of whether it's a federation or one cohesive socialist organization.
If I could jump in, I agree with a lot of what folks have said. I do think part of it is thinking about our relationship to other groups. Part of it's clarifying what our line is on a lot of things. But we also, one of the ways that we're so different from a lot of other groups is we are constantly talking to people that aren't already in the socialist movement and trying to bring people in. It's very critical. It differentiates us from some on the left, and it also differentiates us, frankly, from the nonprofit industrial complex, most of which has no base. And that is, I can't stress enough how important that is to our identity. And part of, we need to collectively decide what it does mean to be a member of DSA, what our line is on race, and what our line is on a lot of things. And we can look to our past history and even our platform process now to think about how to engage our whole membership in this discussion. But we also need to, I think, and I don't think it's controversial at any level of the organization, to say that we need to also develop our new member process, both from helping folks learn what organizing is, engaging people in our campaigns, but also engaging them in political education and exploration. It's really critical and something we have never done enough, and we need to do more of in the future.
So
Yeah.
we only have a couple of minutes, but Beth, did you have something you wanted to add on that question?
Yeah, building on what Maria just shared, in my current role in DSA, I'm involved in the Growth and Development Committee and also one of the membership coordinators of Boston DSA. Honestly, the most difficult existential question that I've faced in the past year is we have this section called "What Does It Mean to Be a Member" in our new member orientation in Boston, and it's just a grab bag of what people want us, of what people tell us when we ask new members, what does it mean to you to be a member of DSA? I think being able to establish some consistency that restores a sense of agency and collective action to people who are becoming more and more jaded by just kind of passively seeing their Twitter just scroll by every morning, evening, and in between. And so I think being able to more clearly and consistently define what it means to be a member, have some clear expectations, is a key way that we move forward as DSA in our continued growth, whether that's through a membership drive, a dues drive, or more in the coming 2 years.
Sorry, I'm in the Jackman office, and our AC unit sounds like a jet engine taking off, so I keep having to mute myself. So I actually I know we're out of time basically, but I do have one final kind of question comment that we could close right after that, which is kind of, and this speaks a little bit of what everyone was saying, especially Bill. When I think about DSA and its growth over the past 5, 6 years, I'm first of all incredibly positive because I saw the trajectory that I thought the organization at least was on before, and I think we're living in, considering the political environment of this country, one of the best possible outcomes for DSA. And also, it's a relatively cohesive organization, not by the standards of what it should be, maybe, but by the standards of the left and the standards of history. Small groups are prone to very spectacular blow-ups, and I think DSA has exhibited a certain sense of resilience that I think we should really be proud of. My thing that I worry about is when I think of someone I'll just use her as an example. My godmother is a Jamaican woman, left of center, a voter, probably doesn't identify as a socialist, but was a big fan of Michael Manley and like Bernie Sanders and whatever else. And when I think about bringing in someone who's been out of politics for a while to, let's say, a DSA local chapter meeting, I kind of wonder, would this person find an environment where they could find a way to plug into politics very easily? Would they encounter an environment where the organization was oriented towards getting kind of ordinary working class people like her kind of into engaged, or would she encounter an environment that is friendly, not hostile or anything, but that's oriented towards people that already know the left, already kind of know the lay of the land in the organization. And I don't have completely negative views. I think if she met the right person at DSA, if she had the right one-on-ones or had the right whatever, it would work. But I do get to this wider question of the left's disconnect from a wider mass base. And before, when we had 5,000 members, it was very easy to see that we didn't have a base. And my deepest fear, mind you, this is just one fear amid many happy thoughts, is that as we reach 100,000 members and beyond, we will kind of lose sight of the fact that we're still, like Bill said, we're still far away from even winning over our 72 million, much less, the 150 million we should really, really have. So I just want to throw that out there as kind of the main dilemma that I see for DSA, which is how to kind of sink deeper roots into the lives of working people, and then if anyone has anything to add, please do, and then we'll just wrap as soon as the last panelist is done. But thank you everyone for listening to.
Well, I'm going to jump in.
Please.
One is there's two parts to what you're raising, Bhaskar, that I think are really critical. One is that I think it's very hard, first of all, to recruit in the ones and the twos. So when you talk about bringing your godmother in by way of example, I think that one of the difficulties in almost any organization is people encountering an organizational culture which is alien to them. And when they come in by themselves, it is very easy to lose them. I've had that experience in multiple organizations that I've been in, where really good people come in, but they can't feel the organization. It's not quite their organization. So one of the things is that that's an argument for bringing in people in waves, so that they are coming in with other people and they can share certain experiences. So that's one point. Then at a broader strategic level, I wrote this paper. It's very unapologetically self-promotional, The Modern Tecumseh and the Future of the U.S. Left. And part of what I'm arguing in there is that we desperately need a large socialist organization that sees its mission as building a popular democratic bloc that can actually fight for power. And taking that on means that we have to really champion good united front politics, being able to work with various kinds of organizations, to borrow from something I saw recently, to walk together as long as we can, right? But understanding that there might be differences that emerge at certain points, and that those differences are not necessarily antagonistic, but that we may have to part company. And so I think that the organization has to see itself as part of that mission, and that really necessitates an immense amount of humility and really, really appreciating the centrality of the United Front. Otherwise, you're building a big cult.
Okay, so someone has to jump in there because I liked a lot of Bill's comments, but we can't end it with your building a big cult.
Well,
yeah. Final word in the DSA.
So I'll be very quick. So I remember his birthday's on Sunday. Joe Schwartz was my big mentor for a lot of us. Was first always a youth section organizer. And I remember when I first met him, he introduced himself at a conference, and he says, "I heard your father was active with us around Chile Solidarity, because my dad's a refugee from Pinochet." And I was like, "Oh yeah, how'd you know that?" He's like, "Oh, so-and-so told me." I was like, "Well, that's interesting. They didn't even bother to say hello to me." And it was a very interesting kind of touching upon different things here. So it's like, people remember real solidarity. So I knew DSA because DSA had been there for my family. So that's real solidarity. You don't always get, so it's like, and that's what Bill's talking about, the waves too. It's like, you have to be present in struggles. You may not get people necessarily, but people know. Also, say hello to people. Be very friendly to them. But I just want to emphasize my last point that I brought up earlier, is I think we're at the point for the future we have to think strategically with humility, as Bill said. And what I'm thinking about when I say strategically is like, where do we want to go? What are the groups we want to be with? And they can't just be to our left. They can't just be to our right. That's where Bill's United Front makes sense. And so it's not just, oh, we want everyone to be union members and rise to the rank and file. That's true, but we also need to figure out what's our relationship with Jobs with Justice. What's our relationship with the existing labor leadership who is progressive? You have to, and I just think it's like, ultimately, it's like, we want to be part of a salad bowl, it's not a melting pot. It's like we bring something distinct, that's what I've always preached about DSA. DSA never gave up on being distinct, but it doesn't mean DSA has to be everything. Beth or Maria?
No, I think that was a great note to end on. Thank you so much. Thank you, Maria, Beth, David, Bill. It's been a wonderful discussion. I hope everyone involved with first of all, to everyone involved with the DSA National Convention, from staff to all the delegates, thank you so much for your work keeping the organization going. And I really am excited to see what the next few years have in store for us. There will be a lot of challenges but to at least have the chance to intervene in political life and to improve the lives of working people. That is an incredible thing. So we have politics as to look forward to, and we have, I think, real victories to look forward to. So thanks to everyone who made that happen and continue to do that, and have a good night.
And everyone, thank you so much, Bhaskar.